I work for a company called Typefox. We specialize in building tools, and our people have like more than 10 years of experience in doing this. And yeah, I will also talk about something exciting related to Spring tools here.
Some springy tools. Yeah, cool. Just to prepare you a little bit, to make you aware of this, the last slot is usually a 30-minute slot here, but this talk is marked and labeled as a 60-minute talk. So if you're wondering after 40 minutes why we don't stop, and you're hungry for lunch, be prepared. This is kind of scheduled as a 60-minute talk. I don't know why it ended up in this 30-minute slot as some other 60-minute talks. So it will run half an hour into the lunch break, unfortunately, but to make you aware of that and not be surprised. I hope you were all aware of that before, maybe.
But lunch is available for another half an hour, so that's you can stay without missing food.
Yeah, the food will be there. I promise. Right. I would like to grab lunch too, so it's just me hoping that. So, okay, so let's dive into that. Talking about the Spring tools and the Spring stuff. Of course, we don't really promise anything. You should not make any business decisions based on what we are saying, but I think you're not here for that. So we talk about the Spring tools for the stuff that we do in our team, which is at the moment basically the most widely used free, open, available tools for Spring as a framework to help you hack on Spring tools and implement your Spring applications based on the Spring framework. So that's my goal. So my goal is you come here to the talk, you use the tools, and my goal is to make you more productive. You go out of the talk or you use the tools, you learn something, and you be more productive basically right away or tomorrow or next week. And that's what keeps me busy and going to work every day to make you and your life as Spring app developer more productive. So before we restart, I would like to get a kind of a brief overview about the audience. Who is using Spring? Okay. I'm glad. Who is using Eclipse as an IDE? Or a variant of Eclipse like Spring Tool Suite already or some kind of distribution? Okay. Who is using IntelliJ? Okay. Quite a good crowd. Awesome. Visual Studio Code? Emacs? Sublime Text maybe? NetBeans? Okay. Okay, cool. That's great. So the thing that we have built with the new kind of Spring Tools 4, and we publicly announced that as a general available first version last year, Spring 1 actually, is an overall of the complete Spring tools for your development environment. In the old days, there was kind of Spring IDE and Spring Tool Suite 3 and things like that. Really kind of having aged quite a lot over the time, focusing on the old, mostly focusing on the old XML way of dealing with Spring and configuring your Spring apps. And we sort of rethought how the tooling should be done, and that's what I would like to show you, what we've done with the Spring Tools 4. You can just download it, use it for free, ready-to-use distribution. And I think it provides a really unique new combination of showing you and helping you with dealing with source code on the one side, but also dealing you with running Spring applications on the other side and combining those two worlds. And we will see a little bit about that. So I think it's really, really awesome. The tooling, as we started to build that, we really focused on what do we need the tools for? What do people use nowadays? And therefore, the tooling is really focused on using Spring Boot. Of course, you can use it for sort of any Spring application. And we, after last year, we got the feedback say, oh yeah, focus on Spring Boot is great, but you should maybe also support this and that, which is not part of Spring Boot. And we did that, so you can still use that for all the Spring libraries and frameworks that you are familiar with, that you're using. But you will see that most of the tooling is really focused on kind of the modern Java annotation-based configuration of your Spring Boot applications. As we thought about redoing the tooling, we thought about what's your daily life as a developer. And as I've seen, some people prefer Eclipse, some people prefer IntelliJ, some people prefer VS Code, some people prefer something totally different. And the landscape is really, really, really diverse, right? And every tool has certain advantages, certain disadvantages, and my job is not to convince you to use a specific tool. I don't want you to switch over to Eclipse, for example, just to use great Spring tooling or something like that. My goal is to make you as a Spring app developer more productive, independent of the tool that you use. So if you say, okay, I use Eclipse, we would like to build something that makes you more productive in Eclipse. If you use VS Code, we would like to give you something that makes you more productive in VS Code, right? And not convince you to switch the IDE to what we think maybe is the best, because we don't really think there's one that's the best, right? It's your choice. And therefore, the Spring Tools 4, you will find extensions for different IDEs. You will find extensions for desktop class IDEs like Eclipse. You can download a ready-to-use distribution of Eclipse with pre-installed Spring Tools 4 included with additional API, additional plugins, third-party plugins. It's just super easy, right? Download Eclipse. If you're familiar with Eclipse, you like Eclipse, that's maybe the preferred way. You can also install that into existing Eclipse installations if you prefer that. That's kind of the desktop class, really big, highly integrated IDE world. On the other side, there are lightweight editors coming up, and people prefer that. They're super small, super lightweight, super fast, super easy to use, like Visual Studio Code. So there is an extension of Spring Tools 4 that is built for Visual Studio Code. So you can get more or less the same tooling that we've built for Eclipse in the same way for VS Code. And as kind of the new kid on the block, there's a third option coming up that we will show you, which is about using Spring Tools in a browser-based IDE. And you might already think about using browser-based IDEs, or maybe it's kind of the cloud-based IDE stuff of the future. Maybe it's an additional option, additional choice. So we thought about, hey, we should support that too, to give you all the options available, right? Desktop class IDEs, lightweight editors, and cloud-based tools. And that's why for Eclipse Theia, you can also, which is a cloud-based IDE that you can use, also completely open source, you can also grab the Spring Tools and use them in your Theia IDE as a cloud-based offering, if you want that. And to allow that, we re-implemented the Spring Tools based on a different architecture. So don't be surprised. We really didn't go through the whole process of re-implementing everything for Eclipse and then again re-implementing everything for VS Code and again re-implementing everything for Theia and so on. We are basing our tools on the language server protocol, which is sort of an architecture to decouple language tooling, and we use that for kind of framework tooling, decouple this tooling from the client, which is the concrete IDE, the concrete editor, whatever. It's invented by VS Code, but it's more or less a protocol between these two worlds. And people can start to implement this protocol on the client side, like Eclipse, Theia, VS Code. They all talk this protocol. And we can focus on the other side, on what's called the language server, and also talk the protocol and implement most parts of our tooling inside of this language server. And that way, it gets really super flexible because you can more or less add this language server into all of these clients without any additional cost. There's a little bit of glue code involved, of course, and if you want to do something special for Eclipse, you need to do that in a special way for Eclipse, for example. But most of the code is really implemented once inside of the language server. And don't be confused by the term language server. It's not a server running on a big server machine in the cloud somewhere. It's really just a separate process on your machine, running side by side with your IDE. And we will see that in action. If you want to learn more about the language server protocol, super interesting stuff, there's URL for that. Really cool architecture. So what did we do since last year? One is, which is not really super Spring related, the quick text search. One thing that we implemented because we were missing that in Eclipse to get really super fast quick search. We contributed that to Eclipse. So now it ships to millions of Eclipse users all across the globe. If you download the latest Eclipse version, 2019-9, I think, you will get the quick text search right away, and you can use that. And that's being contributed from us. Big shout out to Chris, who's sitting over there, who did most of the implementation. It's really an awesome feature. I will show that to you in a second. So what happened in addition to that? As I said, we got feedback about what's good about the tooling, what's bad about the tooling, what are people missing, because our goal is really to move everybody over to the new tooling, to Spring Tools 4. So if you're using Spring Tools 3 or Spring IDE or another tooling, we really would like to move you over to the Spring Tools 4 generation. Right? This doesn't really apply to IntelliJ, because IntelliJ Ultimate Edition already comes with awesome Spring tooling, and we don't really touch that, and that's done by JetBrains, and they build really awesome, great Spring tooling, so we don't really touch that, or we also don't try to convince you to go away from IntelliJ or whatever. Continue to use that Spring tooling, that's awesome, and our extensions are not really available for IntelliJ, but the goal is still to move everybody over from the old tooling way to the new tooling way. So we got feedback about what's missing, what do people need. Maybe we still need a little bit of XML support. So we thought about that. Can we integrate a little bit of XML support for the new world? What is missing? So we just went ahead and added that. And we opened that up to most of the non-Spring Boot projects. I think that's important. So most of the features that you will see, you will be able to use for boot projects, but also for non-boot Spring projects. So that's, I think, an important piece of the puzzle if you're not yet using Spring Boot or not using Spring Boot for every single part of your application landscape. We also worked a lot of performance, which I think is super crucial to developer tools, because no developer really likes to wait for the tools and see, oh, it's building Workspace that's taking ages, or importing the project, downloading the world, or hitting a keystroke, nothing happens, spinning wheel, whatever. People really hate that. I hate that too. So we worked a lot on performance. And one key improvement is already done by the language server protocol architecture, because most of the stuff runs in a separate process. So all the heavy lifting and processing is already decoupled from the IDE, so you can continue typing, continue to do whatever. The processing in the language server doesn't really cause any freezes in the UI or any holdups or so, if implemented correctly. Right? If that causes a freeze in the UI, that's a bug, right? Because it's completely separate, should be completely separate. That's one thing. The other thing is that this separate process that needs to start up. So if you open up your workspace, if you open up your files, the external process needs to start up. So we thought about, hey, we should improve that. We should improve this startup time. And if you've gone to the talk from Dave Sire before, I think 2 slots before in this room, about Spring Boot performance, we were actually able to benefit from that because our language server for supporting Spring Boot is actually a Spring Boot application. So we kind of eat our own dog food and try to use our own stuff. So we benefited from all the improvements in Spring Boot and also worked on additional options. So as you can see in the graph with the different Spring Tools 4 versions, there's a dramatic improvement around version 4.2.2 and so on we more or less cut the startup time into half of the Spring Boot language server, which is quite a nice improvement. It starts up really quick, really good. You will not really notice that, because you don't really see how long it takes, but you will see that in the tooling, when you use that, it responds quicker. One thing that we implemented is kind of the symbol navigation infrastructure. I will show you that. And that took in the old days quite some time to parse your source code, because it tries to understand your source code. So what we did is really you start up the language server, you parse all your source code, all your workspace files, think about, oh, what's interesting for us? Let's see, let's take a look. Building ASTs out of Java files and things like that. That took a while. It was still super fast from my point of view. Just took a few seconds when you started the language server, maybe 10 seconds or so, depending on the size of your workspace, of course, and the class path and things like that. So maybe don't take 10 seconds too seriously, but it was, compared to what it's doing, really fast. but we still thought it's a lot of work that doesn't need to be done every time you start up the language server. So we went ahead and just implemented caching for that. And now it's more or less instant, which is really cool. So you get all the symbol navigation in a more or less instant way, as you can see. So as much as I like to talk about the tooling and the improvements, I even more like and love to show the stuff in action, because I think showing screenshots or something like that, that's not really super exciting when you talk about tooling. So let's dive into that. And I have a Spring application here in my Eclipse workspace. That's the Spring Tool Suite 4 latest version. It's even the latest nightly build. As you might know, there's a super easy way to get started. So Josh always mentioned the second best place on the internet, start.spring.io. You can go there, but there's, let's say, the second best place in your IDE, which is the start.spring.io wizard. It just gives you exactly that. So you can even choose which installation you use, configure everything to create a new Spring Boot project. Say we use the latest Spring Boot version. What do we do? Actuators, you can search for all the Spring Boot starters. You can select them. You get some nice additional information with hovers, where you can find more information about that. Super easy, press finish, and here's your project ready to use in your IDE, and you can just go ahead. Right? Super easy, super quick way to get started with Spring Boot in your IDE, and you can start typing, running stuff, everything. Really, really nice. But I would like to go back to my kind of more favorite demo project. Of course, it's Spring Pet Clinic, as usual. Right? No demo without Spring Pet Clinic. I have a Spring Pet Clinic project here. And the interesting thing is, if you're not familiar with this project, or you would like to find certain things inside of this project, the question is always, how do you navigate your project? How do you find things? How do you understand the concepts of Spring inside of your project? And therefore, we adopted a technique from VS Code, which is called kind of symbol navigation, and raised that up to the level of Spring. So that way, you can just hit a keystroke, and that keystroke gives you an overview about all the Spring elements in your workspace. You can drill that down to the project, to the file, but I will stay on the workspace level. So you can see all the Spring concepts in your workspace. For example, there's a little hint telling you what you can do with this. All these symbols appear in your workspace somewhere. So for example, if you would like to see all the beans, you can just press add plus, add for these kind of annotation-based Spring things. And you can see all the beans that are defined in your Spring application, how they are called, where they are coming from, what are the annotations that they are annotated with. That's, I think, super useful. If you're looking for a configuration, you can say add configuration. You can see all the configurations of your workspace. So where are all my Spring configurations? And the cool thing about that is that the tooling is smart enough to understand Spring and understand that you don't annotate every configuration with add configuration. Sometimes you annotate your stuff with add Spring Boot application, which inherits from Spring Boot configuration, which is a configuration. And the tooling knows that. Therefore, you can see directly in this case, for example, that Pet Clinic application is also a configuration. So you will find that. You will find all your concepts. Even if you define your own annotations that inherit from the Spring annotations, they will show up in the symbol. So you can super easily find all the Spring stuff in your project. And since we are quite familiar with the Spring libraries, as you might imagine, we also did something like, you can easily show you all your request mappings. So everything that you defined in your workspace as a request mapping, you can see, and we extract the path for the URL into the symbol, so you can easily see, okay, so I'm looking for something like owners, that's over here. There you are. You jump to that place. Right. Super easy overview about your project, all the Spring configurations, all your elements, and you can quickly navigate to every place. And that's going to be really, really useful. This even works in a nice way if let me quickly switch over to to a Webflux project, and you know Webflux in a reactive way, there are different ways to define those mappings. You can even define them in sort of a functional way. So it would be interesting to see what happens if I go over here. Again, I try to get an overview about my request mappings. What is there? Oh, there are two oops. Let's see. One is coming from the crash router. I will take a look at what's that. Oh, that's a functional bean definition, a functional Webflux definition, functional route definition. And the tooling is smart enough to extract that. So they get the same overview about all your request mappings, independent of whether they come from the annotation, whether they come from Webflux annotation, or the Webflux functional definition of routes. Super, super useful. But as I said, there's not only, this is all inferred from static source code. Right? We look at the source code, we provide you a view of the source code, but that's only one part of the game. Right? Usually, if you do something like what I will do now, is you start up your Spring Boot application with this nice little boot dashboard. Makes it super easy to start up all your boot apps in your workspace. You can even see what support it's running on, can get a lot more information about that, which I can't go into the details now. But I can just double click, it opens up the default URL, and I see the app. But to be honest, something in this app is not working, which is the welcome message is not configured. That sucks. Why is the welcome message not configured? How can you find out what's going on? Okay, let's go back. Let's take an overview about, is there something called welcome in my Spring, maybe in my Spring Beans. Oh, there's a welcome controller. Let's take a look at that. That sounds similar. Oh, there's a message provider, welcome message not configured. Okay, that's kind of the default implementation here. And it's being injected and used in here, set welcome message provider. So there should be maybe a different one, auto-wired. Why is this guy not auto-wired with something more meaningful? What the hell is going on? Do you have an idea? Just looking at the source code, browsing config files, trying to find out what's going on in your app? That's going to be really, really difficult. So what we can do is we can connect your application and your source code together. So we can switch on what we call live process information or live hover information for a specific app. So I hit a shortcut for the quick access here. That's something new. The way you access it, but it will show up automatically too if you want to. You can connect to this process that we started. So I will connect my IDE and my source code to this process. And what happens is that additional information shows up. And this is now the real information from the real live running Spring Boot application that's being overlaid on your source code. And you can directly see what's going on behind the scenes. In this case, you can see, oh, there's a controller. This controller is actually being created. There is a bean that exists at runtime for this controller. And the mapping is already existing at runtime. It exists. You can use it. I can even hit the quick access over here and jump to that. You can see it's there. It's live. That's great. But you can also see that at auto-wired, it's not green. Something is not green. It's not good. So why is it not green? Where is it coming from? Let's take a look. I will try again and see, is there any message provider stuff being defined in my beans, in my source code? Oh yeah, there's a property-based welcome message provider. That sounds interesting. Let's take a look at that. Oh, that's cool. That's the provider that I'm looking for. So that's cool. Oh, it has a conditional on property in there, and an add component. And interestingly, the add component is not green. Not green, not good. So this bean, this component, actually doesn't exist at runtime. It hasn't been created. And you can see that directly in the source code. This bean hasn't been created at runtime. It doesn't exist in the running application. Why? In this case, it's even nicer because the tooling tells you that this conditional on property is being evaluated at runtime, but didn't find any property. So therefore, this bean hasn't been created. Cool. So that way, I can easily find that out and see that. And I could go back and say, hey, I changed the properties, and magically the bean would appear. I hope you believe me that this will happen. I can show you that, but I'm a bit tight in time. You can really see that. In addition to that, I also want to prove that you can also, of course, enable the bean with the XML stuff, right? So you can go to the XML file, and I have one of the XML files over here, kind of a Spring old-fashioned, old-day Spring. Who's still having Spring XML files in your projects? Yeah, that's for you. That's for you. Right? So we added support for that. So if I save that XML file here, and I go, for example, back to my navigation to say, for example, welcome, you can see that the simple welcome message provider now shows up in the symbols because we found this bean in the XML file. So we are scanning that too, not only your Spring annotations, also your XML files. If you want that to happen, right, you can enable that with the simple flag, and then you can jump there. You can see what beans are defined over there. Of course, we went one step ahead and implemented something like content assist for doing the references, for bean references, so you get all kind of the same information from the symbols inside of the content assist. You can also do some content assist over here, like defining packages and classes if you want to, so you get the content assist for that. Kind of the usual stuff that you would expect when working with Spring XML files in your IDE, right? So the usual stuff. The basic stuff that really works, and it really works in a fast and nice way because you can see it was really quick to show up the stuff. Really cool things. Okay, I'm sure I could show you tons of more stuff about this feature, which is I think really cool. Maybe I can quickly go back to that and enable this one. You can see behind the scenes there's Spring Boot DevTools active, so it restarts the app automatically. Let me go here. Oh, welcome, Spring One platform. That's my proof. I haven't, oh, sorry for that. It's really doing the same thing. And if I would go back to this property-based welcome provider, I could refresh that information. Oops. So I can go there and say, okay, I would like to refresh the information because it had changed. Let's refresh it. And in this case, I see, oh, that property is matched. The component is being active. And it's injected into the welcome controller. So you can even see that if the component is there, where is it being injected into? Where is it being used? Which I think is super useful for your running Spring Boot app, that you get this unique insight into the app, and not with just a kind of a text file or report or something like that, which is already quite useful, but you can see that directly in your source code of your application, which is, I think, super useful and a super awesome feature that we hacked. The same stuff, of course, works in VS Code, as I promised. I said, oh, we implemented it once, it works everywhere. Maybe not everywhere, but the clients that support the language server protocol and sort of where we wrote the glue code or someone else wrote the glue code. So you can see the same live hover information in VS Code. Over here, you can click on that, jump to the application. You can do the symbols over here, right? Get kind of the same symbol navigation in VS Code, get full-blown Java language tooling, things like that. So the same stuff works in VS Code. If you prefer that, that's going to be awesome. Okay, cool. So let me go back to the slides and end my part of the demo, because I really would love to make room for our next section, which is completely new to the space of Spring Tools 4, which is not running the Spring Tools inside of your desktop Eclipse IDE and not in your lightweight VS Code editor, but it's some completely new environment, and I think super exciting environment, which is a browser and a cloud-based IDE. And therefore, I would like to hand this over to Moritz to show us more about Spring Tools and Java tooling and Spring tooling running in a browser-based IDE. Moritz.
And I guess I start with the question that everybody's asking: why? So I mean we have
in the browser.
I mean we have desktop class IDEs. I mean Eclipse is great, IntelliJ is great, and so on. And why should we run an IDE in the browser? And to answer this question, I think we should look at how could this look like, and can we gain something? Can there be, when we do it in the browser, can be something like significantly different and maybe beneficial for us compared to the desktop? And we have so many great ideas from the fields of cloud native and DevOps and so on. And can we maybe apply some of those ideas to running an IDE in the cloud? And to get into this topic, I want to go into details what Martin introduced as a new member of the family of IDEs that are supported by Spring tools, the Thea IDE. So Thea IDE is an IDE that can run in the web browser. Like you can package it in Docker, launch the Docker container, and run it in the web. But you can also package it as a desktop app via Electron. So that's the same technology stack that VS Code is using. There's also a hosted version, GitPod, which can also be used as a self-hosted version. And of course, it runs Spring tools since version 4. And to go a little bit into the details about Thea, it's a rather new project started by Typefox, so that's the company I work for, and Ericsson back in 2017. And my company has a background in building IDEs for software developers and engineers, and we've been doing this a lot based on the Eclipse IDE. And we noticed that a lot of interesting developments happened, like the language server protocol as an amazing new architecture, and web technology as an amazing technology for building great user interfaces, and VS Code as an IDE, which became incredibly popular. And the Eclipse IDE did not look so good in comparison to this one. So we wanted to have something like VS Code, but we were not quite happy with VS Code because we wanted to have something that runs on the web and on the desktop, so that when you build an IDE that you can do single sourcing, that is vendor neutral open source. Like VS Code is open source, but is controlled by Microsoft. And for other large companies, it often is important that they do a larger investment, that it's safe. And we wanted it to be customizable, so not just extendable like VS Code, but also customizable, so like custom branding and so on. But of course, the nice user experience of VS Code using modern web technology for UI and TypeScript as a super nice programming language, and still be extensible with VS Code extensions and Thea extensions. And Thea so far has gotten an adoption that we are very happy with. So besides Typefox and Ericsson, there is ARM. ARM has just released an Embed IDE, or their new Embed IDE is based on Thea. Red Hat is releasing their Eclipse Sharing based on Thea. Google is using Thea in their cloud console. And IBM and SAP also have products that are based on Thea. And just to show how to start this really quickly, if I go to the terminal and make it a bit bigger, I can simply use the docker run command to show it. If I run docker run IT for interactive terminal, I want an init daemon, expose port 3000, and I mount my current project into the Docker container and press enter. Then I have a running Thea IDE. So that was easy. So if you deploy something to the cloud, if you know how to run Docker containers, it's super easy to launch a Thea IDE. But before I go into details on the Spring tools and what else we can do with it, I want to go to my next slide and introduce GitPod a little bit. So GitPod is like a hosted version for Thea with a mission to enable frictionless coding. So frictionless coding in the sense that if you want to do some programming, then you should spend your time programming and not waste time setting up your development environment, downloading Maven dependencies, running Maven builds, compiling stuff, waiting for tests to run. I mean, all this other stuff, which is not actually programming, but somehow tends to eat up our time nowadays. So that's why we focus with GitPod that from your context, like from your Git branch, from your Git tag, from your GitHub issue, that within seconds you can launch an IDE and everything is ready to code. And that really can change how you can work with it. Another situation where you don't want to lose time is occupied workspaces. Like you work on a feature and a colleague asks you to review a PR. What do? Do you stash your changes and check out the PR to review it? Or do you not do it? Or you have one workspace and have long-running tests in that workspace, and what do you do in the meantime? And to address those things, GitPod uses some secret sauce. One is dev environment as code, pre-built workspaces, and parallel workspaces, so running the possibility to run multiple workspaces at the same time. And I will go a little bit into details about this one. Who has heard of dev environment as code? Who has heard of infrastructure as code? That's a few, great. So think of applying these principles of infrastructure as code to your workspaces. So basically having some code that can automatically create your workspace. Or another metaphor that I like, think of the README file from a project, but executable, like a fully automated setup, so that you as a developer don't need to sit in front of the README file and execute command by command manually. And if we take this code, put it under version control, it's really easy to track changes, of course. It's really easy to handle branches and tags. So for example, let's say you upgraded from Java 8 to 11, but half a year ago, and now you need to work on a branch which is 1 year old. You check it out. And along with the branch, you get your old dev environment as code. And on that dev environment as code, Java 8 is still configured. So you still have a valid dev environment for the super old branch with the super old configuration. And you can just keep on working like it was a year ago. It's easy to share in the team, which has interesting economic consequences because the effort to maintain it is just once per project and not per workstation. So if you have a team of 10 people, you maintain it once, but not 10 times like for all 10 workstations. And Docker is a real enabler here. And to look at a more concrete example on how this can look like with a Spring Boot, let's say I push something to Git, then GitPod can work a little bit like a continuous integration server and clone the branch, check if there's a Docker file on that branch, build the Docker file to have a Docker container, and in this Docker container, run, for example, Maven package for your Spring Boot application or whatever you configure, and then store the result as what we call a pre-build. So it's a little bit like continuous integration, except that the result is not what you ship to production. The result is your workspace. And later, let's say Martin wants to open up the IDE, clicks on a link, and then there's already a pre-build for it. So the IDE only needs to load the pre-build, and optionally, depending on what you have configured, it can do other stuff as well, like connect to Kubernetes cluster, Docker engine, MySQL database, or whatever you need. Long story short, you're ready to start coding. It's all pre-built, it's all there already. And I want to show how this can look like quickly. So here I am on GitHub in my Chrome browser. And in my Chrome browser, I have Chrome extension installed, and this Chrome extension adds a new button here to my GitHub view. So I will have this button on every GitHub repo on GitHub. And if I click on this link, a new tab opens. And here in this tab, we can see, first we can see that the URL from GitHub is actually just appended to gitpod.io. So it's gitpod.io /pound and then any URL from GitHub. And whatever URL from GitHub you feed to GitPod, GitPod will be open to, able to open up a workspace for it. And now what we see here is that GitPod actually has pulled a Docker image. And now it's started a container from this Docker image. And now the IDE is starting. And so the IDE has by default opened the README file from the pet clinic, but I will close this and I will make this a bit larger. And the IDE has also started the Spring Pet Clinic application that I opened in the IDE immediately. So we can see that from the moment the IDE opened, the application in my workspace was already able to run because it's already compiled, it's already ready. And to look at how this worked, we can look here at this little config file. It's the .gitpod.yaml. So this .gitpod.yaml is basically like the entry point to our dev environment as code solution. And here in this Gitpod YAML, we see, we refer to a Docker file. So this Docker file gets built by Gitpod on demand to become your workspace. And here in this Gitpod YAML, we also see tasks. So there's init tasks and command. And the init task is the task that here in this project is being run as a pre-build. And the other commands are the commands that are being run when I have opened my workspace. And when I go to the terminal here, I can, of course, see that the pet clinic is running. I can also click a little bit through it to prove that, yeah, it's really a running pet clinic running in my workspace. And when I scroll through my terminal, I find this message. This task ran as part of the workspace pre-build. You just saved 4 minutes of watching your code build. So this message is telling me that everything which is standing above the message ran as a pre-build in a CI-like fashion. And I, as a developer, did not have to wait for it. And that is, again, exactly this, this command up here. Right. And more things that we can do here. We can install some extensions. So here, for example, I have, of course, installed the extensions for Spring Boot, but also for the initializer and so on. And of course, I configure the extensions as code because we do dev environment as code. I can also see the extensions here in the extensions view, so they're installed. And when I look at the extensions, then I see I have a database extension installed. And when I go back to my Docker file and maybe look at the Docker file to see what we actually have in our workspace, here we go. Then we see, for my project, I can bring my own Docker file. So the Docker file can be based on Debian, Ubuntu, or Alpine, or so. In this case, however, I based on a Docker file provided by GitPod, which is convenient for me because it already contains a lot of languages and also a MySQL server. And this MySQL server is already configure it here. And this Docker file installs a few more commands like gcloud and docker and so on. But to show you the MySQL server running in the workspace, I can simply go like this. I can have full access to the MySQL, and I can also use the VS Code extension. I need to select the database here to like browse the MySQL database that is running in my workspace. Right. So that's just a short intro to the environment. But let's go to the source code and also to the Spring Boot extension. But before we go to that one, I want to show that when I open the Java source code, we get all the language smartness that we get in VS Code, because here in Thea and GitPod, we run the same language server that is running in VS Code. So for example, if I press Content Assist here, then we see that we get the exact content proposals, just like we know it from a real IDE. If I hover over a method, then we get the Java doc. And if I do a control click on it, then we navigate to the declaration of the method, which also happens to be source code, which is not in my workspace, but which got pulled in as a dependency, but the source code is available nonetheless. And also the Spring Tools extensions work here. So for example, if I hover this one, do I have it still running? There is the interesting. Something's wrong here. It just took a second to load. Now it's there. Now we see that there is the runtime information or the live hovers from Spring Boot that we can see here. And if I press Command O for open symbol, I can also do the mapping-based navigation into my source code. So for example, I could go to the Java method that handles all requests to /owners. And also if I go to resources and application properties, I should get Content Assist. There we go. Get Content Assist for all the properties that I can use here. Right. Another thing that I wanted to show, since we are working with Java, of course you want to be able to debug this stuff. So I can also select put breakpoints and have a launch configuration here. And when I click on launch, then let's hope, no, I need to skip this part. There's still a bug, unfortunately. But in general, it's possible to also debug Java source code.
It's running the same Java debug extension as VS Code is running, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's running the same. Just the integration with Thea, there's one glitch at the moment.
Yeah. But in general, it's kind of you get the same debug experience for Java as you would get in VS Code, whereas an extension for VS Code that you can just run, launch, and debug your Java apps as you would expect that in a regular IDE, like watching the stack frames and browsing variables and all this stuff.
Right. And as we heard earlier, no place is as nice as production. So let's let's go there, here from our workspace. And so I have pre-configured my workspace with like GitPod allows GitPod allows you to configure environment variables on your profile. And those profiles, those environment variables are being made available in those workspaces that you configure it for. So here I've configured it for all workspaces that are based on my personal GitHub repositories. And then in my workspace, I can use a little bit of, again, dev environment as code to authenticate with the services that I need for being productive. So here, for example, I authenticate with the Google Cloud using a service account that I made available as an environment variable. Select my Google Cloud project, get the credentials for my Kubernetes cluster. I also deploy a Docker engine because I might need that to build Docker stuff in my workspace. And I log into a Docker registry because I want to push images from there. And now that all of this is done, I can, for example, I see there's a Docker engine running. And now, for example, I can run this command again. And this time I don't disable building of Docker images. So this Maven build will now build my, my Spring Boot application. And at the very last step, I mean, it will create the jar, but it will also, at the very last step, bundle the jar into a Docker image. So here we already see the Docker stuff. Here, this is the, you might recognize the output from the Docker daemon. And we get a Docker image, this one. And to look at the Docker image, I will dive into it. I use the dive command. So we can see what's in the Docker image, 1 layer, 2, 3, 4 layer, and only show the changes. Here we can see the app.jar ended up in my Docker image. That is perfect. So I will push the Docker image to my Docker registry. It's pushing only the layers that I have already changed. And then as the next step, I have prepared a little configuration for Kubernetes. It's a Kubernetes deployment that makes use of my Docker image and the Kubernetes servers to make this available publicly. So I can run kubectl with this config. And then Kubernetes will create these two, this deployment and the servers, and we can check if there's already a pod running. Oh, this looks good. There's already the pod running. This looks like the normal log output from this application. That is great. And of course, I have also installed a VS Code extension for Kubernetes, so I can also use this tree view to look at my workloads. So here I see the deployment that I just created, and the deployment created a pod. So this is a running pod. And if I run kubectl get services, I get the public IP address of the thing running in Kubernetes, and here we go. Now Pet Clinic is already running inside a Kubernetes cluster.
Cool.
And I mean, that's kind of like foundation to deploy something. What I find interesting here is that my workspace is actually in a state that I can do this right away, that I don't need to do any additional configuration. It's all there already. And what I also wanted to show is there is a dashboard to open up old workspaces. So if you stop your workspace, you will find old workspaces here. And another thing, if we go to GitHub, to Thea itself, choose a random pull request, click on this pull request. There's also a GitPod button. We can also launch launch a GitPod button based on this one. This is about, first I want to show that we can have like many workspaces running in parallel, and they are all like separated from one another. So I can do a pull request review here while keeping my workspace running there. And also GitPod provides the mechanism to like conduct the review from inside the workspace. But we are running a little bit out of time, so I won't show this in detail. One more interesting thing, you can share workspaces. You can share a running workspace with another person, so two people can, or multiple people can work with the same running workspace container. And you can share snapshots, which is basically sharing a copy of your workspace to somebody else. And with that, let's go back to the slides.
Okay, great, awesome, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it opens up a whole new world to these kind of development environments. As you can see, it's really configuring your stuff and then having your dev environment spinning up with everything configured, like databases, access to your kube control commands, to the right pods, to your right cluster, everything. For a project that maybe you haven't touched for half a year, and that kicks off in a minute maybe, or in 30 seconds or whatever. I think that's really amazing. And you still get the full-blown developer experience, right? Maybe we haven't really shown every detail, but you get the full-blown Java developer experience running for that. So it's going to be, who would be actually interested in running those things? Who could imagine that, hey, maybe I can try something out, like maybe it's kind of, it feels alien to hack in a browser, but who could imagine actually doing that? Yeah?
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Great.
So a quick outlook before you all go to lunch. I guess very hungry. Usual stuff. So we ship the Spring Tools 4 updates every 4 weeks. If you're interested in that, just update to the latest version all the time. We still keep the old Spring Tool 3 in maintenance mode. So if you're interested in that, or you still need that, please let us know. If you really need specific features that only exist in Spring Tools 3 and you're urgently missing from the new tools, let us know, because we really try to keep the Spring Tool 3 on a minimum maintenance level, and that will kind of fade out over time. We try to push everybody over to Spring Tools 4, so if there's something missing, we will be super happy to help you and maybe add additional features that allow you to move over to this new, I think, amazing world of tooling. So please give us the feedback and let us know. That will be super interesting. If you're interested in GraalVM, we also did some kind of experimental work to run the Spring Boot language server as a GraalVM native image. So we will not ship that yet. It's super experimental, but then we get the startup experience even down to from 1 second to maybe 20 milliseconds or so. That could be even more awesome. Cool. Thank you all for coming. Of course, I forgot something super important, which is to tell you at the beginning you can ask questions anytime, which is great to say at the end. But yeah, so sorry for that. I just forgot that. But we'll be super happy to answer questions if you have some. We are running a bit out of time, I guess. So I guess you're all hungry, but maybe, I don't know, 1 or 2 questions, and then come up and we can answer questions in front of the audience when everybody else is leaving for lunch. Yeah, one question? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the question is whether the keyboard shortcuts are the same across the IDEs. Unfortunately not, because in VS Code we just hack into the symbol navigation that exists in VS Code. There's an existing keyboard shortcut for navigating symbols, because not just our symbols, all the symbols that all the language servers provide. So we just need to use that. And in Eclipse, of course, that keyboard shortcut is already used for something else. So we had to kind of invent our own one. But of course, you can in all the IDEs, you can configure that yourself if you want to. But I see that's would be great to get this get this working across the IDEs. Maybe someone else? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sear is very lightweight as well. I mean, we have a little bit of a memory cost on the client side in the browser, but that is so low that with a normal laptop you can without problems run, I don't know, 8, 9 tabs open with one Sear instance each. And you have a little bit of memory cost on the server side, because there we're running a Docker container, and in the Docker container there's running all the language servers and your development stuff. And how much memory you need there really depends on your project. I mean, Maven is usually, I don't know, depends, like 3-4 gigabytes to run a Maven build. I mean, depending on the project, obviously. But I think what's interesting here is that the overhead on the server side is extremely little, because it's just Docker plus language servers and then the tools that you actually need. So there's no large operating system like what you have in a VM, and there's no extra kernel like what you have in a VM.
Cool. Thank you all for coming. If you have additional questions, come up here. We are super happy to answer more questions and discuss more stuff and get feedback. Very welcome. And thanks a lot for coming. Have a safe trip home. Thank you.
Thank you from me as well.